Hi, welcome to Bernard's Essay Talk, and today's question is: how far was the leadership of the WSPU responsible for the failure of women to get the vote by 1914? I'm going to talk about this in 4 different parts. In the first, I'll talk about the responsibility of the leadership of the WSPU, which effectively means talking about Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurt, and here they are in their prison garb. In the second, I'll talk about the responsibility of the wider movement, including that of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. In the third, I'll talk about the responsibility of external personalities and forces. And finally, in the fourth, I'll evaluate the arguments along 3 possibilities, asking whether the leadership had full responsibility or shared responsibility or even diminished responsibility. And by way of conclusion, I'm going to argue that violent militancy was responsible for the failure to secure the vote for women by 1914. However, the responsibility for this, the violent militancy, is to some degree shared with the wider rank and file of the WSPU, and even diminished by the circumstances of the time. So beginning with the first then, and looking at the responsibility and the failures of the leadership, I think there are 2 types of failure here. The first is a failure of strategy, and the second is a failure of organisation. And starting with the failure of strategy, I think the main argument here is that the embrace of violence was a strategic mistake. And it was a mistake which locked the WSPU into a strategy of escalation. And it was either unwilling or unable to fully appreciate the harmful consequences of this, one of which was that it proved very inflexible to adapt to new circumstances. And most crucially, it was unable to strategically or tactically find a way to influence the government at the very moment when that government was closest to giving women the vote in 1912. And the consequences of this was that it alienated its allies. It alienated the moderates, it alienated sympathetic politicians, and it also alienated public opinion. And this left the WSPU completely isolated and also prone to splits, such as that which created the Women's Freedom League in 1907. And more generally, its failed strategy and inflexible organisation sabotaged a golden opportunity to secure the franchise with the Conciliation Bill of 1912. And most obviously, it failed in its own intention to force the government into concessions. Partly, I think, was because it never used enough force or created enough economic damage or social disorder. And ultimately, it was those who were expelled who proved to be strategically right. So that not only did the public and politicians become resentful of extreme forms of militancy, so too did loyal long-standing members. Emmeline and Frederick Pethwick Lawrence believed that the leadership was sacrificing goodwill and sympathy, and the Pankhursts appeared increasingly fanatical and dismissive of both the public and some of their most loyal colleagues. So those were the failings of strategy. Now what about the failure of organisation? This also, I think, relates to militancy, because to realise their militant goals, Emmeline and Christabel ran the WSPU like an army, arguing that illegal protest required secrecy and discipline and military authority. And so the WSPU was run by a centralised committee made up mainly of the family and friends of the Pankhursts. And this was progressively authoritarian, top-down, unelected, dictatorial and intolerant of opposition. It made policy, decided on strategy, controlled the publications, controlled appointments and controlled the finances. As well as that, it was completely ruthless to those it considered no longer loyal or useful, as was shown in the treatment of the Pethwick Lawrences and indeed of Sylvia Pankhurt, Emmeline's own daughter. So overall, this was a leadership strident and inflexible and dogmatic. And because of this, it was unable to build a mass movement to sustain any kind of violent campaign, enabling the state to gain the upper hand by arresting its leaders, raiding its organisation and cutting off funds. So by 1914, its position was very precarious. It had run out of steam, it lacked ideas, its leadership was disjointed and was losing authority. So that's the failure then of the leadership. Now let's turn to section 2 and what responsibility the wider suffrage movement might have to play in this failure to get women the vote. And here it might be argued that should not the failure of conventional peaceful forms of persuasion share the responsibility for the lack of progress? I mean, after all, the WSPU was created after 50 years of fruitless meetings and leaflets and petitions and writing letters, a good deal of which was conducted through the NUWSS. And as such, should it not bear some responsibility? Conversely, many argue that the WSPU was more anarchist than autocratic, rejecting the idea of top-down control for autonomy and heroism from below, where local branches and passionate and independent radicals like Emily Davidson would first initiate violent tactics such as window breaking or stone throwing or letter burning and arson, only to have them endorsed retrospectively by the leadership. And such a view extends the responsibility from the leadership to the larger body of the WSPU. Okay, so that completes section 2. Now let's look at section 3 and the responsibility of external personalities and forces. And here we should begin with the notoriously anti-suffrage Asqith, who, whenever possible, undermined attempts at legislation, believing that too much reform made too quickly would fundamentally damage stability, and who is far more concerned with the problems of Ireland and social reform and industrial unrest and the crisis with the Lords. So that basically he just hoped that the whole question of female suffrage would just go away, and who, in the words of the course book, could not comprehend why women would want the vote and regarded militant protesters as unnatural. And so too his Liberal government, which time and time again refused to support reform bills, and in the face of WSPU militancy progressively restricted suffragette freedom, denying them forms of protest, banning their meetings, refusing to meet deputations and accepting petitions. In addition to this, it continued to deny their prisoners political status, instigated force feeding and passed measures such as the Prisoners' Temporary Discharge for Ill Health Act, better known as the Cat and Mouse Act in 1913. And finally, there is the question of party interest, where the suffrage cause became interwoven with numerous calculations of political self-interest. So, for instance, Labour was worried that giving the vote to women might alienate working class men, whilst Liberals feared that Conservatives could gain advantage over the Liberals as they had done so in 1867 by rather cynically, since they didn't really believe in it, offering suffrage to propertied women, thereby increasing their own votes and outflanking both the Labour Party and the Liberal Party. So that completes the third section, looking at the external personalities and forces. Now let's evaluate the arguments, starting with full responsibility. This is really made by those who emphasise top-down autocracy over bottom-up anarchy. In other words, it's the leaders who were really in charge. And taking this position, it argues that Escalations of militancy were not really a response to repression, but a calculated political act conducted by a professional organisation, organised and carried out by a small number of paid staff. And all of that very much in the line of the Leninist model, looking to a dedicated professional vanguard body to drive the change. And evidence for this view can be found in the fact that changes in tactics were coordinated and escalations of militancy were synchronized, and that could have only come from a working leadership. Also, the fact that once the authorities were able to decapitate the leadership of the WSPU, as they did in 1913 after a series of raids and arrests and trials, the number of bomb and arson incidents fell dramatically. And again, this would suggest that it was the leadership that was making these things happen. Okay, so that's full responsibility. Now let's turn to shared responsibility. And this is based on the idea that responsibility can be shared with both the moderate NUWSS and the radical rank and file of the WSPU. Thus, while the WSPU was the preeminent suffrage organisation for a decade before the war, as argued earlier, the NUWSS had unsuccessfully campaigned years before the WSPU was even formed. And equally, while the strategy of violent militancy between 1912 and 1914 was instrumental in the failure to secure the vote, this was a joint responsibility between the leadership and the rank and file. And although some might find this distasteful, it seems to me that in many ways the relationship between the Pankhursts and their rank and file, which today we would call their base, has some kind of similarity with the relationship between Trump and his base, with a kind of symbiosis between the leadership and activists, between the charismatic leader and the loyal follower. Although it has to be said, both are still very much shaped by the instincts and personality of those respective leaders. And finally, there is the idea of diminished responsibility. And here it can be argued that winning the vote was a long, hard and complex process, made still more difficult by the circumstances of the time, with the government facing numerous crises that required attention: a constitutional crisis, industrial unrest, the threat of force by Ulster Unionists, and a precarious international environment on the cusp of war. In this context, perhaps it's unfair to place full responsibility at the door of the suffrage movement when both the WSPU and the NUWSS had done so much to make it a realistic possibility. In reality, it was operating in circumstances beyond its control, circumstances which ultimately worked against it. As the course book argues, winning the vote was a long, hard process. A fragile political context, personal objections to women's franchise, and the complexities of parliamentary procedure all undermined attempts to enfranchise women. And so, to conclude, it can be argued that the leadership of the WSPU shares the responsibility for the failure to secure the vote by 1914. But this was a responsibility not only shared, but to some extent diminished by the circumstances of wider social, economic and political crisis. Indeed, because of the efforts of both the WSPU and the NUWSS, by 1914, the question of women's suffrage was not a case of if, but when.